My name is Seraphina the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Seraphina the Masked Lady. Hello, my delicious darlings, and welcome to our first episode for December 2023. Is it just me, or do the years fly by faster the older we get? I remember a long time ago when I was a girl, every season lasted an age, and a year was an eternity. Now, they blink by in a heartbeat. That makes it even more vital for us to make the most of the good times and cherish those who love us and whom we love. Because this is a special episode, I have decided to share a brand new prose story with you. It's called The Hollow Howl, and it's about a man who loses sight of the significance of human connection and the terrible price he pays. So settle in, snuggle down, and get ready to shiver. Here we go. The Hollow Howl. Chapter 1. It was a dark and stormy night. Ashdown Jones, known as Mr. Jones to his colleagues, and Ash to his few real friends, rolled his eyes and set the paper he'd been reading aside. The story was only 5,000 words long. Still, he wouldn't waste even part of his journey on a narrative with such a cliché opening sentence. Ash was a partner in a publishing house, a respected businessman in an industry that had struggled ever since the evolution of e-readers. He was joint head of the team that had kept Artisan Print running in the black for the past 10 years. His time was precious, and only the best of writers could hope to have their work featured in his publications. This writer, he didn't even bother to glance at their name, had not made the grade. One of the pleasant peculiarities of Ash's insistence on reading submissions on paper was that he would have the joy of burning the rejects once he was done. The rhythmic sound of the train's wheels on the track faltered for a moment as the gale outside buffeted it, the carriage wobbling from side to side in a manner that, in a more insightful person, might have engendered the observation that this particular December night really was dark and stormy. Ash simply glanced around the carriage, satisfied to find he was still the only occupant. Tonight, the usually busy train was almost empty. Well, it was December 25th, after all. The news stations had been bleeding for a week about the Arctic storm that was predicted to send Santa's sleigh toppling from the skies. Most of the usual commuters would be sitting around Christmas trees right now, dozing off in excess of food and hours of opening presents that they would be paying for the rest of the year. Either that or they were sacked out in the pub dreaming of happier times. For the past 2 years, Ash had spent Christmas Day alone in his penthouse apartment, squinting at his laptop, and looking forward to the 27th, when the world would slowly regain its collective sanity. When the pandemic hit, Artisan had been quick off the mark in arranging remote work for every employee. Who could possibly avoid coming in? They had been lucky. When the British lockdown was extended into weeks, and then into months, bored, lonely people had started searching for entertainment. Many had returned to their childhood fascination with the written word. The company's security and catering arrangements had been made through outside organizations, so Ash couldn't speak to that. Still, no direct employee of Artisan had lost their employment. Ash's other business affairs had not prospered so entirely. Still, he had recorded a profit over the first 24 months of the pandemic. However, as 2022 had continued, and the number of hospitalizations had diminished, Ash and John had agreed that getting their staff back into the office was a necessary move. The decision had been received with a mixture of grumbling and resignation. Ash's partner, John, had suggested that at least one of them should be in the office daily, meetings or not, so that their staff would see that they, too, had shown willing. Mostly, that didn't bother Ash. He found it easier to get into the correct headspace on location anyway. As to working Christmas Day, that was no big issue. Ash had no family, he didn't like restaurants, and the wives and children of his colleagues annoyed him. He would rather work than sit alone in his too expensive penthouse apartment, watching festive television. That only reminded him, over and over, that his life was not what it should have been. Well, not what the mush brains who filled the supermarket queues thought his life should be anyway. Given the pit of degradation and childhood poverty that Ash had climbed out of, he thought that he was doing pretty damn well. All in all, it was only the inclement weather that had made attending the office today inconvenient. Ash's mild concern that trains might not be running on the holiday had been allayed in mid-November, when Southern Rail had announced they would run a limited Christmas Day service. The last train should have been full of partiers, actors, musicians, doctors, nurses, and many others who worked in the capital, but lived in the seaside city of Brighton and Hove. Sadly, Southern Rail had been counting on a payday that would not now come.
Sucks to be them, I guess.
Ash thought, and allowed himself a bitter smile. The only saving grace for the rail company today was that no guard worked the train tonight. The driver was the only employee on the locomotive. At first, Ash had been pleased not to have to show his yearly pass, but he was beginning to find the silence within the metal walls unnerving. Had there been conversation around him, the sounds of laughter and excited human beings, it would undoubtedly have annoyed him. Then again, perhaps the chatter of the cattle would have dulled the furious roaring wind beyond the carriage. Ash glanced at the window, hoping to gauge the stage of his journey, but he saw no buildings, no lights. The darkness outside formed a blank black canvas against which he could see only the ghostly image of his reflected face. The sight gave Ash a chill. He looked pale and melancholy, like a lost spirit hovering miserably in a freezing, empty space. The wind roared again. The train tilted. This time, when it settled, Ash thought he heard a shriek and a metallic clunk as if the wheels had left the right rail for a moment before setting down again. Ash shook himself, then picked up the next submission to the new anthology. They needed 16 stories for the ghostly collection, and he intended to have selected all of them by the close of Boxing Day. Once that was done, they'd go ahead with art for the cover, and it would be printed and ready for dispatch before Halloween. Their ghost story collections had been bestsellers for the last 4 years. Ash intended this one to be even more successful. Last year, Ash's bonus had almost equaled his basic pay rate. After all the trouble, he was counting on another big payout come April. Anyway, he didn't want to think about what had happened. Even nearly 12 months after it had all gone down, he still caught the odd person looking at him askance and wondered if they recognized him as the subject of the scandal. Well, let them judge. What did he care? The plebeians didn't know what they were talking about, and all that business in the papers had done nothing to mend matters. Ash might be in the business of selling scary stories, but he was the last person in the world to believe that he was living in one. The world was a place of simple checks and balances, pluses and minuses that a thinking man could arrange so that the final column always showed in the positive. Helen Jensen had been a hysteric and madwoman, and her tragic end had been caused by her own foolish behavior. Ash was still ruminating on Helen Jensen's eventual And when his carriage was filled with a wrenching scream so horrible that, for a moment at least, it eclipsed all thought. In that brief time, Ash ceased to be a competent, modern-day businessman and was reduced to the status of man's first ancestor, a terrified tribesman. Hunkering in the dark, certain that the screaming beyond his cave was the voice of a demon hungry for blood. A second later, the screech was replaced by a crunching and then a loud thunk. The train ceased its forward locomotion so suddenly that Ash lurched forward across the table, scattering his documents over the carriage floor. Once he had caught his breath, his mind cleared, and Ash swore loudly.
Bugger. Demons, ghosts, and furies.
He mocked himself.
You idiot. The damn train has hit something, that's all.
That certainly seemed to be the case. After a moment, a voice, cracked and garbled as always by the ancient speakers, announced something to do with an obstacle on the track. Ash remained bent over for a while longer, forcing the breath back into his lungs. Eventually, he was able to steady himself. Ash straightened, running his gaze around the carriage. For the first time, it occurred to him that the absence of a guard on the train might be a hindrance rather than a help. The driver had mentioned something about a collision and a delay but had given no further information. Since he was securely locked into the cab, that left nobody Ash could apply to for information. For the next 15 minutes, Ash was forced to do the one thing he loathed the most: sit idle. As soon as he was able, he gathered the fallen papers from the carriage floor. Sadly, the fall from the table had thrown them out of order. Had the available light been steady, he could have remedied the issue. Sadly, seconds after the crunching sound of impact, the lights above and around him had begun to flicker, leaving Ash without the means to make out which page was linked to which. Resigned to inaction, Ash had taken out his phone, opened his email account, and begun filtering through his correspondence. For a while, the toing and froing of the business world occupied Ash's attention. As time went on, however, Ash began to feel slight consternation. The lights still had not returned to the familiar constant glow, the train had not moved, and the prolonged silence over the speaker system was beginning to feel unnerving. He closed his email and rose from his seat. Slowly, he moved down the corridor. His balance felt a little off, and it took him a while to realize that it was because the train floor was at a slant. It was not so extreme that it could be seen with the naked eye, but there was a definite change to the angle. They hadn't broken free from the tracks. That would have caused much more extreme damage. But something was off. Suddenly, Ash wanted company. The speaker message had instructed passengers to stay in their seats. Presumably, that also meant sticking to their own carriages. Despite that, Ash moved into the next carriage, hoping to find someone else waiting. Probably as annoyed and bemused as he was. The seats were all empty. The next 4 carriages were as deserted as the first. Ash's apprehension had built from a low hum to a roar by the time he'd reached the 6th carriage. The storm's battering had reached a fever pitch, screaming over the stalled train, and the empty carriages amplified the sound. Suddenly, on the verge of panic, Ash hurried back down the train, seeking the comfort of his own seat and his familiar possessions. He had thrown himself into his seat before he noticed a woman sitting in the group of chairs opposite. She was bundled in a hooded winter coat that still looked wet from the melted snow. Her head was tilted at such an angle that her face was hidden. But at that moment, Ash was as pleased to see her as if she'd been his oldest and dearest friend.
Hello.
He exclaimed. The woman didn't look up but murmured something under her breath.
If I'm honest, I'm relieved to see you.
Ash admitted.
I was beginning to think I was the only person on the train.
No. Her voice was thin and distant. I am here.
Have you heard anything from the driver? Apart from the first announcement, that is.
Nothing yet, the woman said.
No, me either. I don't even know what the train has run into. I hope that it's more than a case of wet leaves this time. If I have one more journey cancelled because of unusually wet rain, I think I am going to scream.
Scream. The woman agreed.
Well, hopefully, they'll have us moving off soon.
Ash shivered, noting that the temperature in the carriage had dropped dramatically. He pulled out his overcoat and shrugged it on, buttoning it at the waist.
Hey, listen.
He said,
Why don't you come over and sit with me for a while? We can keep each other company. This isn't a night a person should be alone on.
No,
the woman replied.
it isn't.
Well then,
Ash gestured to the seats opposite him.
be my guest.
The stranger seemed to hesitate, but in a moment, she rose and then relocated herself.
You must have got on the train recently, right? I can see that you're still wet. I don't envy you having been stood on the platform in this downpour.
The storm screeched again like a cat in a fit of fury.
It really is a wild night.
The woman shrugged.
I've been here for a while.
Ash nodded, doubting her, but not thinking the point was worth arguing. In the silence that followed, Ash took a closer look at his fellow passenger. At least, he tried. She still had the hood of her coat up. He could see her hair, a mousy blonde peeking out from underneath her hood. It was dripping wet. Apart from that, the rest of her features were hidden.
Do you want to dry your hair?
Ash asked the woman.
I have a clean towel in my gym bag. You're likely to catch your death of cold if you don't warm up quickly.
There was a slight hesitation before the woman said.
Yes, thank you.
Ash reached for the towel. A brand new, white, Egyptian cotton number, of course, and passed it to the woman. He blinked in surprise when she reached up and lowered her hood. She was pretty, even beautiful, with pale skin and enormous dark eyes. She was young, too, barely old enough to be called a woman.
Are you here with someone?
Ash asked. The woman shook her head.
No, I'm alone.
Well, you picked a hell of a night for it.
The woman nodded, then glanced out of the window. She couldn't have seen much in the dark void beyond, but something must have unnerved her because she clasped her arms around herself and shivered.
Are you hungry?
Ash asked.
There's no buffet car on this service, but I have some hot soup in a thermos. I made it at the office.
Pleasure lit the woman's face.
What sort of soup?
Rich tomato.
She positively dimpled at that.
My favorite.
The woman offered him her first genuine smile, and Ash decided it was the most perfect he had ever seen. His hands actually trembled on the thermos as he extracted it from his bag. Ash watched for a while as the woman poured the soup and began to drink it, slurping a little in her enthusiasm. Normally, Ash loathed poor table manners, human bodily functions, his own excluded, had always unnerved him. The woman's pleasure in the food was contagious, however, and Ash found himself smiling for the first time since he'd boarded the train.
So, what do you think we ran into?
Ash asked when the woman had finished her meal. She shrugged.
I don't know. Maybe it was one of the old storm gods.
It was an odd thing to say, but Ash decided to roll with it.
I know what you mean.
He said,
The night is a little apocalyptic. Not really in keeping with the season, is it?
Tragedy happens every day, even on Christmas.
Ash ignored the gloomy observation.
I'm Ash, by the way. Ash Jones.
Hella.
The woman replied. Ash liked the name. It was an unusual one to find, especially in the southern parts of Britain, but that signified little. These days, expectant parents could look up a whole pantheon of unique monikers with a few taps of a button. Ash thought he remembered Hela being a goddess from Nordic legend. However, his loose memory of a book read in childhood supplied no more information than that. So, the name didn't mean that his companion was a Dane or a Swede. Still, her fair skin, and the blonde hair, which lay in luxuriant coils over her slim shoulders, were pale enough to prompt the guess that at least some of her bloodline hailed from the snowy reaches at the top of the world. They also provoked Ash's desire to bed her, if at all possible.
Your parents were into Norse mythology, I take it.
Ash asked, following the question with his most charming smile.
Among other things.
Ash was about to ask if Hela had a religious conviction against using more than 3 syllables in a conversation, when a large projectile of snow and sleet hit the window with a bang. A percussive sound followed, and it took Ash a moment to realize that the storm had now added hail to its repertoire.
It must be near freezing out there.
Hela observed.
Yes, it must.
Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the violent sounds of the storm.
So, where are you headed to?
Ash asked Hela. Hela raised an eyebrow.
Well, you're on this train, So the odds are you're headed for Brighton. But where after that? And would you like to see the inside of my penthouse?
He added silently. Hella shrugged.
I don't have any firm plans.
You have no family, no friends, not even a hotel room. You'll have trouble finding a place this late at night.
Hella seemed unconcerned.
I'll do well enough. Anyway, it's not your concern.
No,
Ash said.
I suppose not.
After all, plenty of other people are on the streets tonight.
What do you mean by that?
Ash demanded, feeling nettled. He narrowed his eyes at the woman, trying to find anything familiar about her face. After everything that had gone down last year, more than one pretty woman had come onto him, only to reveal themselves as journalists searching for a scoop. Hella, however, didn't seem bothered by his tone.
Nothing.
She said mildly.
I just mean that shelter can be an issue for anyone, especially in the winter.
Yeah,
Ash said.
I guess that's true.
Anyway,
Hella continued.
I have people who will care for me if needed. They're a little wild at times, but they are loyal.
Ash was getting bored.
Well, I guess. It's important to have good friends.
More important than you know.
Hella said.
Who else will speak for us when the world turns against us?
No one.
Ash said.
Everyone is out for themselves. As soon as there's a whiff of trouble, they all decamp like rats fleeing a sinking ship.
The girl raised an eyebrow.
Hardly a cheerful thought.
It is based on experience, believe me.
He might have said more, but at that moment, the train tipped so violently that it felt like it had been upended by a furious giant. Ash and Hella came loose from their seats and tumbled onto the floor, Ash landing on his elbow. Hella came down on him hard, compressing him in a place that no gentleman ever wants to be squashed. Ash swore loudly and shoved Hella off his lap.
What the hell was that?
I don't know.
Hella looked pale and flustered. The hand she raised to mop her forehead was shaking, and there was a bleeding graze on its lower side. Ash grabbed the tabletop and pulled himself upright, swearing when his right ankle twinged. He didn't reach back to help Hella stand. He was already inching down the lower seats when she spoke behind him.
What are you doing?
I've had enough of this. All of this spooky shit is too much. We need to find out what's going on. And we need to find out now.
I thought that you had already searched the whole train.
Well, most of it.
Why not all?
I got tired.
Tired. Ha!
Ash didn't like the threat of mockery he thought he heard in her voice.
Do you mean scared?
Of course not.
Ash tried not to think of how dark and empty the silent carriages had been.
Well, I guess we're going to have to check again.
Hella said. Suppressing a groan, Ash nodded.
Don't worry.
Hella teased.
I won't let the monsters get you.
Chapter 2. Ash's second walk down the train was much more complicated than his first. The train had settled at such an angle that he couldn't take more than one step without sliding sideways into a bank of seats. Hella seemed to be having the same problem. He could hear the soft clunk as her ankles bumped into the seats and the low exhalations of her breath. It occurred to Ash that he should slow down and offer to help her, but he was still annoyed at her for needling him about his fear. Instead, he made a special effort to build up speed, enjoying the sound of her huffing and puffing as she tried to keep up with him. He hadn't considered that he was also pushing himself too far. His sense of accomplishment quickly faded. By the time they reached the driver's compartment, Ash was wreathed in sweat and panting like he'd played 10 games of squash in a row. Behind him, Hella was still making soft wheezing sounds. The door to the cab was closed. When Ash attempted to open it, he discovered that it was locked.
For F's sake.
Raising his hand, he knocked smartly against the cab door.
Hey,
He said.
wake up and open the door.
When there was no response, he knocked again, this time harder. The silence continued until Ash swore and kicked the door. There was a dull boom, and the door slid open. Whatever relief Ash briefly felt vanished when he opened his mouth to berate the train driver, only to see that the driver's seat was empty.
What's going on?
Hella's voice faded away.
Hey, where's the driver?
Clearly not here.
Ash stepped into the cab, peering out of the curved front window. It took a minute for the weather to clear enough so that he could see the track.
He's not outside.
Ash said.
Not in front of the train, anyway.
Well, he would hardly be behind it.
Ash snapped.
We've clearly run into something. I can understand him wanting to look at the impact site, but he's not going to be wandering around the place in the middle of a snowstorm.
Looking to the left, Ash saw a large barrel-sized torch on a small shelf. When he picked it up and pressed the power button, a painfully bright light illuminated the space around them. Ash blinked. Behind him, he heard Hella let out a soft.
Whoa!
Ignoring her, Ash aimed the torchlight out of the window. The beam was powerful, but half the light was reflected back by the window pane, and what remained only penetrated 2 or 3 feet into the storm. All in all, Ash saw nothing helpful. Certainly not a competent train driver ready to take him and Hella home.
I don't get it.
Ash's voice was rising now.
Where the hell could he be? He's hardly likely to have gone for a stroll in this weather.
Maybe something frightened him.
Hella's voice echoed oddly in the small space.
It would have to be a hell of a scare to send him out into the open tonight.
Some things are even more terrifying than a winter storm.
Not many.
Ash said.
Don't you think so?
Annoyed, Ash rounded on Hella to tell her he'd had enough of her eerie pronouncements. Hella was gone. Ash blinked at the place where Hella had been, then blinked again. The void remained.
No.
Ash murmured.
No way. That's not possible.
The darkness was unmoved by his protests. Ash was about to observe out loud that the situation had to be some kind of joke, when it occurred to him that he would have thrown away any story containing such cliché dialogue.
Okay.
He said.
Hella was here. Now, she's not. So she must have gone somewhere. I didn't see her. I'm not sure how she left, but she's got to be somewhere on the train. When I find her, I will understand what is going on.
The sound of his own voice echoing against the sides of the train was far from comforting. In some ways, it made him feel more alone than before. Despite that, Ash continued talking to himself, much in the same way that a man whistling past a graveyard keeps up his tune even after it has occurred to him that it may cover up the footsteps of the specter following behind him.
First, though, I need to contact the main station.
He stepped further into the cab. The cramped space was startlingly cold. It couldn't have been more chilled if someone had left the air conditioner on full blast for an hour before he'd entered. Of course, the driver wouldn't have done that. For one thing, it was well below freezing outside. Any intelligent person would have the heating turned up as high as it would go. The cold might have come from outside, but surely the train company would have insulated the cabin just a little. Shaking away confusion at the chill, Ash bent his head and peered at the dashboard. The collection of lights, buttons, and dials was utterly bewildering.
What is this?
He muttered.
A train or the bloody International Space Station?
The knobs and dials in front of him were just as incomprehensible as if they belonged to an alien spaceship. At least the cab still had power. Red and white lights still shone on the dash. Ash squinted at them but only succeeded in making his vision blurry. The only thing Ash found even vaguely familiar was a removable handset with a button on its side. It hung from a metal hook by a curved wire. A radio handset, Ash thought. That will do the trick. Someone at the headquarters will be able to tell me what is going on. He lifted the radio set and pressed the button to activate the connection.
Hello.
He said.
Hello, is anyone there?
Silence.
Hello, come on, I'm stuck here on a stopped train in the middle of nowhere. The driver is gone, there's only one other passenger with me. And if we don't leave soon, then another train is going to hit us.
Only crackling static answered him.
Right.
Ash told himself.
We need to change the radio frequency.
Squinting at the dashboard, he found the frequency dial and twisted it. To begin with, there was only the roar and hiss of static. Eventually, however, Ash was able to locate a channel. He pressed the button on the handset and spoke again. This time, Ash thought he heard someone respond. Whoever they were and wherever they were talking from, they didn't get to finish. There was a high-pitched squeal, and the words were cut off as if by a blade. Seconds later, a high-pitched scream exploded from the radio, filling the cab.
Damn.
Ash yelled, pressing his free hand to his right ear. The scream seemed to go on forever, building louder and louder until Ash was sure he would go mad. His eardrums were bleeding by the time the awful sound dropped away. Ash leaned on the dashboard, panting. The wails and moans of the wind outside continued, but now their quality seemed mocking.
No. Come on.
Ash fiddled with the dial. He pressed the button again.
Somebody talk to me.
The whistles and pops grew even louder, but there was no answer. Ash might have been attempting to communicate directly with the storm. Just as the static reached its height, there was a loud bang, and all the lights in the cab went off. Suddenly, the storm outside was no longer abstract. Ash could have sworn it was running its frozen fingers up his spine.
Fuck.
Ash yelled, slamming the handset down on the dashboard so hard that the plastic fractured, cutting into his hand.
Shit.
He kicked the cab wall, bruising his toes and causing the last remaining light on the dials to flicker and die.
God damn it all to hell.
Yanking his tie loose, he used it to bind the wound in his palm, cursing again when a trickle of blood seeped out to stain his shirt cuff.
That's 150 damn pounds out of the window.
Suddenly, Ash was aware of the night pressing against the walls of the cab. The freezing darkness beyond him now took on an identity, a furious personality glaring at him. The space around him seemed to be full of presences, as if hundreds of consciousnesses shared the few feet near him. Nor did the intelligence observing him seem friendly. The sensation of being watched was so unnerving that he had to fight the urge to drop to his knees and hide. Only stiff-necked stubbornness kept him fiddling with the unresponsive dials a few seconds longer before he stood up and headed back into the first carriage. Chapter 3. Hella was sitting in the buffet car. That was wrong. Ash knew it. It wasn't even possible. There was no buffet car. Hadn't he shared his soup with Hella less than an hour ago? Soup he'd brought because this train didn't provide a buffet service. He'd been up and down the train at least twice tonight. He had not once encountered anything that resembled a buffet car. Still, here he was, standing next to the serving counter, looking down the twin line of cream-colored booths at the last one, where the woman called Hella was sitting with her back to him. Ash recognized Hella, but something was horribly different about her. He could still see her beautiful blonde hair falling down her back, but now it was thin and patchy, with pieces of skin and flesh showing through in the gaps. Her clothing had changed too, becoming twisted, soaked and rotten, as though she'd been submerged for many hours in freezing water.
Come here.
The figure ordered. The authority in its tone was inescapable. Ash tried to fight its pull, to turn away and retreat to the driver's cubicle, but he found that it was impossible. His feet dragged slowly over the uneven floor of the train. In a space of time that seemed both brief and eternal, he found himself standing opposite a creature out of a nightmare. The thing sitting in the cream leather booth was enough like Hella that he couldn't deny her identity, but strange enough that his eyes skittered away from it in revulsion. If his companion had ever been human, she certainly wasn't now.
Sit down,
the creature said. Ash swallowed a gasp.
No, I think I should go.
Sit!
The creature roared. Ash was in the booth before its voice had ceased to vibrate.
Good,
the creature said.
Now, you will sit quietly and listen to what I have to say. You will speak only when I ask you a question. Do you understand me?
I hardly think.
Ash started to bluster.
Quiet!
The thing roared. Ash lowered his head. His mouth was dry, and he could only utter a rasp when he tried to speak.
I take it you had no luck with the radio.
The Hella thing asked in a voice that sounded like half-melted slush being poured down a storm drain.
I tried to get through. Nobody is answering.
The creature smirked and nodded as though it had not only expected the answer but approved of it.
I tried changing frequency.
Ash went on.
I must have called a dozen times, but there was only static. The world might as well have disappeared around us.
Perhaps winter really has devoured the world.
The creature suggested. Ash caught the echo of gleeful laughter in her tone. He shivered.
Isn't that how the Vikings believed the world would end?
The thing asked.
Ripped into pieces and then eaten up by eternal winter.
Stop it, okay?
Ash pleaded.
I need to know what's going on here. Why did you look so different before? Who or what are you?
Your fellow passenger.
The creature said.
But
A passenger, that is enough for you.
Ash lowered his eyes. He wanted to protest but could not find the words. The creature had him transfixed. His body was frozen as if in ice. He could not have budged an inch to save his life.
Can you at least tell me what you're doing here then?
The Hela creature looked away from him. Her disinterest needled Ash, but he didn't dare to raise a complaint.
Did you know
She said, her voice a little wistful.
that, in some northern cultures, the spirits of the wrongly killed are thought to fly the teeth of the winter wind? They race across the world at the head of bitter snowstorms, seeking out those responsible for their deaths.
they do.
Yes. According to the legend, when the spirits find their murderers, they take their revenge on those who killed them and left them trapped in an icy purgatory. Once that is done, they are finally able to rest in peace.
Ash scoffed.
Are you telling me that there are demons out there right now, in the blizzard?
Not demons. The spirits in the storm tonight did not choose their damnation. It was done to them, thrust upon them by the selfishness of others. You could call them vigilantes. Of the spiritual kind.
Ash cast a nervous glance towards the window. The Hela thing slammed its hand on the table.
Look at me.
I'm sorry.
Ash said.
I'm sorry. I was just thinking. You said there are spirits out there right now. Souls riding the storm.
Yes, that's it, exactly.
But I can't see them.
The creature shrugged.
They are dead. You are living. Few living beings can see the roads that phantoms tread.
Then what is the point? Why bother flying the teeth of the wind if no one can see them?
The creature chuckled.
Those responsible for the wrongful deaths always see their victims. Even the storm-blown do not only want reprisal, they want justice for the wrongs done to them. It wouldn't be justice if the killers didn't know why they were being punished.
What about you? What are you doing here tonight?
The thing shrugged.
The same as all of the other storm-blown.
A chill raced through Ash. He clenched his hands into fists, pressing them so hard against the plastic table that separated him from the Hela horror that he was surprised it didn't break.
That can't be right.
Oh. Why, pray tell?
Because even if such things are real, and you may just have changed my opinion on that, there is no reason for anyone to hunt me.
Have you done nothing wrong in your life?
I'm a businessman. I work hard. I play hard. Some people might not like what I do. I've taken others' success and made it my own, but I've never killed anybody.
Are you sure of that?
Of course, I'm sure. I have never been in the army. I've never shot a gun. I've never even gotten into a fight bad enough that someone might get hurt. There's no reason for me to see the storm blown.
After a helpless pause, Ash tried again.
Look, you want my attention. There is a reason you're here, probably something significant. I get it, but right now, we need to get our asses off this train. We've been stopped on the tracks for far too long. This might be the last passenger train of the evening, but there will be cargo runs in the early hours. If this train doesn't move soon, if we can't get hold of help, then a later train will run right into us. We'll be killed.
So you want us to leave?
The Hela thing asked.
Yes.
Ash said.
What about that was unclear?
So that we will be safe.
Yes.
What about the people on the other train?
What are you talking about?
The other train. There will be a driver and guards on it, right? If there is a crash, then they will be killed.
Urgency prevented Ash from pretending compassion.
So what?
Well, surely we can warn them. There must be emergency flares on the train somewhere.
Where? We've been here an age. I don't have time to look for them. Besides, the driver couldn't see them through the snow. Look at it.
He waved his hand towards the window. There was no darkness left, only a wall of screaming white.
But did it occur to you to even try?
Why should it? They are not my responsibility. My duty is to myself, not some stranger.
The face of the creature, as foul and degraded as it was suddenly gripped by sadness. The emotion was so profound that even Ash could not help aching with sympathy. He almost said something, asked if he could help or offered comfort. But the Hela thing beat him to the punch.
Is that true?
The The creature's voice cracked and whistled from its desiccated throat, reaching a note so sharp that it made Ash wince.
Are you your only priority?
Of course, who else should be?
The Hella creature shook its head but did not comment further. When it next spoke, the creature asked Ash.
You said that you have done nothing to make the storm-blown hunt you. Correct?
Not a single thing.
It cocked an eyebrow.
What about what happened to Helen Jensen? Do you think she would have an opinion on your claim to innocence?
Ash's heartbeat faltered. Sudden horror trickled through him, turning the blood in his veins into ice water. Ice pellets rattled against the window glass like artillery fire.
How? How do you know about that? Did you read it in a newspaper?
The rotten half-mouth lifted in a terrible sneer.
Do I look like the kind of girl with a regular newspaper subscription?
No.
Ash said.
No, of course not. It's just.
I know that there was a woman called Helen Jensen. That's enough. As for the details, we have time. You can tell me about it.
Ash heard his voice tremble.
I would really rather.
Tell me the truth.
The horror demanded. This time, the creature didn't raise its voice, only stated its demand with a kind of leaden monotony. Despite that, Ash felt an invisible force compelling him to answer.
It doesn't matter. It was just an accident, a misunderstanding.
Tell me.
The Hella thing roared, its demand so loud that Ash reeled backwards, colliding with the carriage's wall. He stayed where he'd fallen, tilted back against the cold metal. The thing that had once been Hella raised a half-decomposed hand and reached out, moving to place its rotten, peeling palm on his cheek.
No!
Ash screamed.
I'll tell you, okay. I'll tell you. I'll do anything, just don't touch me.
Chapter 4. It had all seemed like such a good idea when it started. A colleague of Ash's had let slip that he made good money by investing in properties in Brighton. More specifically, he bought up properties that had been declared unfit to live in, renovated them as cheaply as possible, and then rented them out to students and other young people. The man, Ash called him Franks, had near magical luck in sourcing dirt cheap properties. On a particularly boozy night in a local club, Franks had confessed to Ash that he got tips from his cousin, who worked for the council department that inspected and certified properties. Franks had proposed a deal. He had a profitable portfolio and didn't necessarily want the responsibility and time pressure that would come with buying and leasing further buildings. On the other hand, his cousin had dropped a couple of new leads into his inbox, and Franks certainly wasn't averse to increasing his profit margin. The deal was simple. Franks would pass property tips on to Ash, who would purchase the buildings and finance the renovations. Once the buildings were fully tenanted, making a healthy profit, Franks would get a small cut for his assistance. Of course, Ash hadn't leapt onto the bandwagon right away. He wasn't stupid. He'd researched, run the numbers, and looked into the income tax implications. In fact, he had waited a full 14 days before telling Franks that he was in. Over 12 months, Ash had purchased and then leased 22 properties all over Brighton and Hove. Most of them had worked just as Franks had promised. Students had moved in with their laptops and expensive course books, and money had poured out. There had been a few minor expenses, but the profits had still been more than satisfactory. Then, Helen Jensen had leased his largest one-bed apartment, and after that, everything had gone wrong. Helen Jensen had been a postgraduate student at the University of Sussex, a pretty young woman with a sharp mind and a first-class bachelor's degree in English. Unfortunately for her, like most professional students, she'd also possessed a woefully limited bank account. Despite that, Helen had reached her limit when it came to living with a constantly changing group of housemates. So, over the last few months, she had scraped together just enough money to rent a ground and first-floor maisonette. She'd had a good credit rating for someone so young and a decent history as a renter, so Ash hadn't foreseen any problems. They'd signed the papers. Helen had paid the first 2 months' rent in advance, plus insurance and a security deposit. She'd taken custody of one of the two master keys and moved her belongings into the apartment. If he was honest, Ash had forgotten about Helen as soon as he'd deposited her check. Then the phone calls had started. Ash had thought he was dreaming when Helen began to talk about a ghost. Apparently, there'd been strange noises in the apartment. Initially, Helen had dismissed them as a plumbing issue. Later, she'd noticed that her possessions were moving. Things had disappeared. First pasta tongs, then a pen, then a brooch. At first, they'd been returned at odd times and in unexplainable places. Finally, they hadn't reappeared at all. She'd started to hear strange voices and see shadows moving around the flat at night. It had only been a few days before Helen had realized that she needed help. At first, the tone of Helen's messages had been calm, even logical. She had been approaching the problem in the same way that she would a repairs issue. Ash had agreed to send a plumber around. Within 3 hours, the man had phoned him back with an all clear. No trapped air or leaking pipes could be blamed for the nocturnal noises. When Helen confided that she thought someone was sneaking into her home at night, Ash had gritted his teeth and agreed to pay for a change of locks on all doors and windows. That, though, had been his limit. The next time he'd spoken to Helen, he had told her that the spook show should had to stop. Helen hadn't taken any notice. She'd kept calling, her pleas becoming more and more desperate. First, Ash had ignored her calls. Then he had blocked her number. She had changed phones and reached out to him again. Helen had left messages begging him to move her to another apartment, a room, even a cupboard if necessary. Ash hadn't answered. There hadn't been any point. He hadn't had any other properties available anyway. As far as Ash had been concerned, the problem was all in Helen's head. Ash had decided to take some time off work over that Christmas season. He'd eaten, drunk, and let his calls go to voicemail. By the time Ash had received Helen's last sobbing phone call, it had been December 22nd. Helen had been screaming, incoherent. She had begged Ash to come to the flat to at least attempt to witness what she was dealing with. Ash had been tired and a little hungover from a Christmas party the night before. He hadn't wanted to deal with a hysterical woman, so he'd switched his phone off and gone to sleep.
What happened then?
The hella thing asked. Ash shook his head.
Something terrible.
Oh,
It wasn't my fault.
Ash protested.
I didn't know she'd be stupid enough to race out of her warm home and into a snowstorm. She could have called a friend or got a place in one of the local hostels. If worst came to worst, she could have got a bed at a homeless shelter. There's one on every street corner in the city. She didn't do that. She ran out of her apartment barefoot into the middle of a snowy night and fell asleep on a bench. She was.
yes.
The Phantom asked.
She died.
Ash concluded.
They found her body on Christmas Day. The aftermath was awful. A national scandal. The papers blamed me. My face was everywhere. There were hate campaigns. Someone even started a petition for me to kill myself.
Is that all you care about? Yourself?
No, but I didn't deserve the blowback that I got. I had rented her a place to live, a decent place. It wasn't my fault that something in there scared her. I didn't put a ghost into the place. I don't even believe in ghosts.
But you do believe in people. Helen was a young woman, little more than a child. She was in need. She reached out to you for help when she had nobody else, and you failed her. You allowed her to die. That's the problem.
There was nothing that I could do. All of my properties were let.
We both know that's not true. Sure, your longer-term lets were all occupied, but you had a new 2-bedroom flat in the town center just off North Street. You finished the renovations the week before Helen moved into her place. You could have easily moved her there for a few days until something more secure opened up.
Well, yeah. But
But you didn't want to fill it because it was nearly New Year, and you knew that you could make a killing hiring it out as an Airbnb. Tourists wanting to enjoy the festivities would pay hundreds of pounds a night for a place like that.
there's nothing wrong with making a living.
No, there isn't. But allowing a woman to freeze to death on a park bench when you could easily have prevented it is a moral failure.
I guess.
You guess.
Look, I didn't mean for her to die.
But you didn't care enough to stop it.
It was sad, but it wasn't my fault.
You could have saved Helen Jensen easily. You didn't bother.
She wasn't my responsibility.
Ash cried, furious and desperate.
Okay,
The thing called Hilla said.
if that's how you feel.
Chapter 5. Until the last moment of his life, Ash never understood how he got out of the buffet car and onto the rutted ground beside the train. One moment, he was staring into the dark pools of the Hella thing's eyes. The next, he was standing in the blizzard, burned and sighed by the freezing wind. The cold stole his breath. The pain in his muscles was awful. Ash made a strangled, gargling sound.
Cold?
He muttered.
Too cold.
His heart was stuttering, his muscles seizing up in protest at the bitter atmosphere.
No, this is no good. I have to get back onto the train.
I thought you wanted to leave.
The Hella thing's voice said. Ash turned to blast her with scathing language, too angry now to fear her fury. Instead of seeing his former companion's decayed and mottled form, Ash found himself face to face with a pretty blonde girl. The newcomer didn't seem to feel the storm's wrath. The howling wind did not so much as lift her pale hair. Ash recognized her instantly, and once he did, he couldn't understand why he hadn't seen it before.
No,
Ash said.
No. This isn't possible. You aren't Helen Jensen.
The figure offered him an eerie smile.
Oh, but I am.
But you're dead. Aren't you?
If anyone should know, it's you.
Then what were you doing on the train? Wait, it doesn't even matter. It's too cold out here. We need to get back inside.
Helen shook her head.
I'm afraid that will not be possible.
Of course it is. The bloody train is right there.
He waved at the long metal cylinder.
I can even see the carriage door.
Helen said nothing. Ash turned back to her.
Come on, be reasonable. Nothing can live out here. Just let me in.
No.
By now, Ash was shaking in desperation.
Look, I'm sorry, all right. I'm sorry for what I did to you. You're right, I was a pig. I should have listened. I should have helped you. I did the wrong thing. And I am so glad you didn't die. I'll figure out some way to pay you back for the distress I caused. But I'll freeze if I stay out here one moment longer. We have to get back onto them.
Helen made a small gesture with her fingers. A flicker passed in front of Ash's eyes. When he looked up again, the train and the track were nowhere to be seen.
What the?
Ash gazed around, fighting to peer through the blizzard.
What did you do? Bring the train back.
Bring the train back.
Helen mocked.
You see, you don't really think that I'm just Helen Jensen, that I somehow survived that terrible night in the open. You saw what you made of me in the buffet car. That was how I looked when the police found me. I died because of your selfishness and greed. I died, but I had no home to go to. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't go forward. That was when I became one of the storm blown.
I'm sorry.
Ash repeated.
That might have saved you.
Helen tilted her head at him.
Sadly, I don't believe you.
Why not?
You told me so yourself less than an hour ago. I didn't do anything wrong. You said, it wasn't my fault. You never once hinted that you understood what you'd done. You're only saying it now because you fear the storm and its denizens.
As if!
Ash replied, desperately feigning denial.
What do I have to be afraid of? There is nobody here but us.
Oh,
Helen smiled softly.
is that what you believe?
She turned away from him, looking into the storm.
Come out, brothers and sisters.
She called.
Stop it.
Ash said. Helen ignored him.
Come out wherever you are.
She sang. Ash was on the point of letting out a mocking laugh when sheer pandemonium broke forth around him. At first, his mind could not comprehend what he was seeing. Through the curtains of snow, dancing shadows appeared against the wall of wind. First one shape, then two. 5. A dozen capering, jumping things came gibbering, leaping through the air, performing fantastic arabesques as they were buoyed by the storm. Ash wanted to look away, but he could not. Once he had seen them, some foreign force fixed his gaze. Here, Ash would see a leg, there a foot. Perhaps a crimson eye or a yellow dribbling tooth. There was a creature that looked like a pale pink, fleshy grasshopper with blue spines that marched backwards across its forehead and down its spine. There was a creature so burned that it resembled a live cinder. The only anthropomorphic thing about it was a pair of agonized, pleading hazel eyes. He saw something like a leather-covered skeleton with a mouth full of broken teeth and a spider thing with the face and torso of a woman. When more and more faces began to part the flakes and leer in at him, he thought that he would expire from the horrors on show. They were terrible, the creatures of nightmares, and yet the worst thing about them was that, in their eyes, lay something that had once been human. After a time, Ash didn't know precisely how long, only that clocks would have counted it in minutes, and it felt like an eternity. He couldn't take it any more. He shrieked, the sound as inhuman as the beings in front of him, and dropped into the snow, clasping his hands over his head and cowering.
Make them go away!
Ash begged.
Make them leave! I don't want to see them anymore!
Helen laughed. Unlike Ash, she sounded glib and carefree.
Don't be so cruel. They just want company. No soul should be alone on Christmas Day. Right?
A creature darted towards Ash, slashing at him. 3 long, bloody gashes appeared on Ash's chest.
Ouch!
Ash cried out.
That hurt.
Did you think that it didn't hurt me when I froze to death?
Helen challenged.
Or does it only matter when the person suffering is you?
I don't know.
Ash sobbed.
Well, I think you'd better figure it out.
Ash shook his head, covering his eyes with his hands.
Go away!
He whimpered.
All of you, please just go away!
Silence fell beyond him, marred only by the sound of the wind. When Ash looked up, the capering ghouls had disappeared. So had Helen. Ash was alone. All at once, the storm-racked void beyond him became more terrible even than the threat of the storm blown.
Helen?
Ash called into the storm.
Helen, where are you?
Nobody answered him.
Please don't leave me out here alone. Helen.
There was no reply. With no other option left to him, Ash began to walk, hoping to see a building, a barn, or some other kind of shelter. But the snow was almost up to his knees, and every stumbling step stole more of his dwindling energy. He walked for what felt like an hour, but was probably more like 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, with all of his strength gone, Ash sagged forward onto his knees. He rolled to his side, then onto his back, looking up at the bruised clouds and the snow falling down upon him. He'd heard that death by hypothermia came with inexplicable warmth and a feeling of peace. There was none of that for him, only fiery agony racing through his veins. It was as though some power had judged him unworthy of the blessing that eased the transition for other unfortunate victims. Ash was crying, his lungs burning with every breath. The teardrops froze on his cheeks.
God help me.
Ash whispered.
Please.
If a greater power was listening to him, it did not respond.
It's so cold out here.
Ash whispered, reduced by his extremity to the state of a frightened child.
Don't let me die alone.
You aren't alone.
A voice said. Looking up, Ash saw Helen standing above him. She no longer looked pale or lost. Indeed, her cheeks were rosy red, and her dark eyes were shining.
Help me.
Ash begged, stretching his hand out towards her.
Please, don't leave me out here to freeze.
Helen smiled at him. The compassion in her eyes was terrible. She looked sad for him. Indeed, the glow of pity was so deep that, for a moment, Ash believed Helen would save him. Then, however, she shook her head. The last thing Ash heard before the snow covered him was Helen Jensen's voice.
It isn't my fault. You aren't my responsibility.
Well, what do you think about that? Was the ghost of Helen Jensen really hunting the man? Who let her die? Or did the bleakness of the weather cause Ash to have some sort of nervous breakdown? Are there demons in storms? Does that explain why the wind sometimes screams? And did Ash deserve his ultimate end? Drop me a note in the comments and let me know. Until then, I wish you a very happy first week of December. May the run-up to Christmas treat you warmly, and any snow be just thick enough to support a one-horse open sleigh. Oh, and remember, When you meet with friends and family, leave an extra place setting for the spirit of a past loved one. After all, we don't want to anger the loving spirits, do we?